that for many years, as you'll see, I've had this issue of trying to do something more with qualitative data than just report it straight. And this is an issue I've been dealing with for many years, and trying to find different ways around to, in some sense, quantify qualitative data. And just recently, I've been working with Leah, and Leah has particular strengths in quantitative inquiry. And in coming together on a couple of projects, we've been able to, for me anyway, I've been able to advance my thinking and procedures around that. So the idea here is to share some of these ideas and some of the practices with you, and hopefully it'll be useful. Please feel free to provide comments, and we'll have lots of time for questions, I hope, at the end. So how I'd like to progress is firstly, just talk about the aims of this event. And then I'm going to base the discussion around particular research projects. And so they're grounded, their discussion would be grounded in particular research projects, which might not be of interest to you, but it's just providing a grounding for that. And so the first ones are about interviews, trying to understand the contributions to people's learning. Then the use of critical incidents to provide grounded instances of learning. Then looking at the use of work-life history interviews and how we're able to use quantitative methods to look at patterns within that. And also perceptions of continuing education, another project currently occurring in Singapore, where we've had a very large number, 180 graduates of CET programs have interviewed, and 40 employers, etc. So lots of interview data, and what do we do with that? And then some discussion, clarification, and queries. So, as I've said, there's been this long-standing challenge of trying to do something more with qualitative data, and in particular, trying to use it to identify patterns and depict patterns. And so that's been a key concern. And so it's about optimizing the use of qualitative data. I'm in my home office at the moment, and I've got cupboards here absolutely full of boxes of transcripts. And I know that what I'm only using is a tiny fraction of that data to report things. And as you know, when you've got a 6,000 or 8,000 word article, you only can have so many quotes. And so there's an awful lot of data doesn't seem to be optimized. And I should state here, by the way, straight up front, that over the years, I've tried working with various qualitative software packages, initially Nudist, I think it was called, and then more recently NVivo. And I'm still not convinced that they give me the kind of outputs that I'm looking for. I'm not necessarily opposed to their use, but they're not able to address some of the things that I want to do with the data. And also easing the process of analyzing large amounts of qualitative data. I think what we know is that you can hold about 11 things in your working memory at a time, and that the convention when you're reporting research is to try and get things onto one table which sits on one page, etc., etc. But when you have a whole range of qualitative data, it's often quite difficult to do that. So trying to find ways of doing that. I work with people who are quantitative researchers, and often they say about qualitative research, oh, it's just a set of stories. What do the stories mean? And then I say to them, well, what do your numbers mean? But this raises questions about the reliability and validity of qualitative data. And as a editor of a journal, I sometimes see articles that, as a reviewer, where people just use quotes, but there's no basis for how the degree by which those quotes are representative of the data body. Are they typical? Are they atypical? What are they? And this leads to conclusions that perhaps cherry picking is going on, that quotes have been selected out of convenience rather than scientific worth. And so the quantitative approach to qualitative analysis is perhaps helpful, and perhaps a more broadly accessible process. So this then leads to this discussion about how can we secure quantitative outcomes from qualitative data. So we've got some objectives for this webinar here. There they all are. Hope you'll get some understandings about it, how it can be used, categorizations, how to use numerical scales, aligning quantitative and qualitative analysis under the same framing. So Leah's done some work where she's brought together data from NVivo and SBS outputs. Okay, let's start somewhere. So many years ago, I used interviews mainly to try and understand how people learned. And one of the first studies I did was for the Queensland government, and that was trying to understand how workers initially learnt their vocational knowledge through 3 or 4 different educational pathways. And so it was attempting to understand that, and also how people continue to learn their skills for their working life. The data gathering then, as I said, was through interviewing people about how they learnt their vocational knowledge, and from that also looking to find a way of categorizing and analyzing that data. So you'll see there, this is 1992, 1993, just as I was commencing my career, the first year I was at Griffith. And so there's possibly people listening to this who weren't even born then. Anyway, so what I did was I asked people questions about how they'd acquired their skills. And so these are the questions as a very novice researcher I asked. You'll see them there. What does it mean to be a skilled worker? How did you acquire those skills? What was useful about this? What was limitations? And what do you think is an ideal way of acquiring skills for your type of work? And what you'll see there is that the first 4 questions are very much about the what is the current circumstance, whereas the 4th question is speculative, what should be. So 2 different kinds of questions there. And in terms of continuing the development of their skills, similar questions about how people learned and what way the workplace supported that learning. So these were just questions to generate data. Now, what I was asked to do was to look at these different modes of skill development and identify the kind of contributions that they might make. And so you'll see here, there are 4 kinds about what is referred to as the integrated model, which is like the apprenticeship or the traineeship, where the learner spends some time in the workplace, but also time in the vocational education institution. There is the formal pre-employment mode, where you go to vocational college first up, or university first up, and then you go into the workplace. And then from the on-the-job mode of learning, where you learn solely on the job, and then also people going straight from school to on-the-job mode of skill acquisition. So I got all these responses to the people that I interviewed, and you'll see them here. And so what I did was, when there were particular concepts or particular representations that I thought were all the same, I then counted them up. I aggregated them. And what you'll see here, that under each of these modes of skill development, there was a particular listing of them. And you'll see that I've listed them numerically, and then you have some kind of weighting, you have some kind of ranking of what these people say. Now, I think the trick with doing this that I kind of tried to utilize is, there's a risk that you can reduce them right down to just 2 or 3 things. So as long as the items, the responses are distinct and unique to a degree, they represent distinct categorizations. On the one hand, you don't want 2 or 3, but on the other hand, you don't want 20, I don't think. I think you need to come down to a sort of workable number. And that's what I've tried to do here. So you get these responses, and you know that some are more important than others. However, it's also important to remember that even though some of the frequencies are low on some of them, that they might be particularly important for particular kinds of learners or for particular kinds of learning. So then I gathered some data about what should be the speculative stuff. How should how should a particular mode be improved? And this one then is the on-the-job one. And then you'll see here, there's a list of responses, and some are valued more than others. And you get, for instance, the second one there, where people say, look, it's so good, there's no improvement. You get that kind of response. Now, the point is, we've got these 2 data sets here, and there's more there as well. So there's a big long list there of how it could be improved. The workplace learning could be improved. And then what this allows you then is to do a comparison across those 4 modes of skill development, And you can compare the actual, what they said they've done, with what the ideal is. So we're dealing with small numbers here, but it allows you to see and you establish patterns. And what you can see in many instances that the actual is in some ways different than what people preferred. And you'll see, for instance, that there's tiny numbers there, but there's the school straight into the workplace, wasn't seen as being ideal, whereas the formal pre-employment one was seen as being about similar between actual and ideal. And then with the integrated approach, more people, a greater percentage of people thought that was ideal rather than the actual people that undertook it. So it allows you to take sort of verbal data and do something with it and put some numbers on it and make some kind of comparisons. So using qualitative responses for a quantitative comparison. Really early stuff done a long time ago. Now, later on, I was interested in trying to, not too much later, but I was interested in trying to get more grounded data on how people learn. And so what I used was a series of critical incidents. And the point of using critical incidents is they're actually grounded in particular events that people have engaged with. And this is seen as being more valid than simply having, off the top of the head opinions. And what I used was 3 kinds of critical incident in the interviews. Firstly, I'd ask people when they'd had a high moment recently, when they'd been able to achieve something they hadn't been able to achieve before. The second kind of incident I asked them about was when they'd succeeded with a new task, but had needed some assistance, when they hadn't been quite able to achieve something in the workplace. And then the third one was when they'd had a stuff up, when things went wrong. And, what I would ask them, who or what was lacking in that. So you can probably see that these 3 questions, although they're distinct, they're all directed in a sort of triangulated way to understanding what was helpful when things went well, what was needed when you weren't able to quite complete a task, and then when things went terrible, what was lacking. So it's all directed towards trying to understand the worth of the educational experience in the workplace. And so the analysis then was identifying sources of support that were there, absent or needed more of, that were supportive of that learning. I also did analysis of different kinds of learning as well, but I won't refer to that here. So this is what the actual interview item looked like. I would ask them that question and say, what happened? Why were you able to be successful? And how did you acquire that knowledge? I also gave them a list then to rate a particular set of experiences. Now, these choices that were here came from 2 sources. Firstly, early research, such as observing and listening to other workers, everyday activities, the work environment. But also in this particular study, the one I'm referring to here, this was taking place in a large secondary process plant where they'd spent a lot of money on developing modules, computer-based text, videos, and put in place mentors, and then sent the entire workforce off to an action thinking process 2-day workshop. And they were very keen to know about the outcomes of all of this. So what happened was then that the person would tell me the issue that they'd addressed, how they'd had a success in this case, and then I'd get them to indicate on a scale, and I've given an example here of between 1 and 5, what they said was helpful to that particular incident. And then this then allowed me to aggregate all of these responses to these critical incidents over a period of time. And on this table here, the responses are aggregated, and the ones on 5 are the ones that are obviously most helpful through to 1 which are least helpful. And what I've done in this table is I've highlighted the 4 processes that were particularly sponsored by the workplace. Now, the people who sponsored this research, this workplace, weren't at all happy with the findings here, because what it indicated is that the thing they'd spent a lot of money on weren't particularly helpful. And you know, they weren't happy about that. But it was having the kind of analysis here, having the figures here, having the incidents that people were talking about in their workplace, which then provided clear patterns. And what you can see from the patterns here is the kind of things that the workers report as being helpful in their problem solving was things such as, you know, everyday activities, observing and listening, other workers, the quality of the working environment, plus direct instruction from more experienced workers. So this then provided a patterning of responses from qualitative data into a quantitative account. And it was particularly important in this study because there were some tensions between me, the researcher, and the company, who was concerned that the things they'd spent money on wasn't seeming to be particularly effective. I used a similar approach in another study a couple of years later, and this is in a large food processing company, and it's quite likely that many of you this morning would have, in your breakfast, had the products that come from this this plant, which is situated in rural Victoria. And in this instance, I used this process of critical incidents, and I used them a series of 4 times, the 3 critical incidents 4 times over a 2-year period, to monitor the learning that was occurring in this workplace. And what this table here is quite simply an aggregation of those 4 sets of 3 critical incident interviews. And this table looks very confusing, and it is, but what it brings down is 2 years data gathering onto 1 sheet of paper. In the left-hand column, you'll see the participants, and they're identified by an Arabic character and also a number. The C refers to the consumer or customer service center. E refers to the extrusion plant where your breakfast cereal is made. And P refers to the packaging area within that workplace. And they responded over time to the contributions to their learning from mentors, their everyday activities, observing and listening, the workplace, other workers, group discussions, and process for extending their knowledge, as well as a set of interventions which were undertaken associated with promoting questioning, the use of coaching, explanations, and the use of modeling. And what you can use this table to look at is you can either go across the rows to see how individuals engaged and what they thought was helpful, or you can look down the columns at the particular contributions of the support that learning support that's provided by these particular kinds of support. What you'll see in the right-hand columns is that because the questioning, the coaching, the explanation and modeling and diagrams were done quite intentionally, I also tried to capture a measure of the frequency that they had been used. And so the D's there refer to how many times they've been used daily, W, how many times they've been used weekly, and M, how many times they've been used monthly. The point being that the everyday learning stuff occurs all of the time, whereas these were interventions. So this then table allows me to bring all of that qualitative data that was gathered through these critical incident interviews together that have been done over 2 years. And I realize there's a lot of detail here, it's hard to follow, but the idea, by the way, if you look down here, the way that I've tried to make this table easy to understand is that the 2 highest for the individual are bolded and the 2 lowest are underlined. The maximum number you could get here, because these are indicating whether people indicated 4 or 5 for utility of these sources. The maximum number you could get is 12, because 4 interviews, 3 critical incidents per interview, 12. And you'll see then that some of these contributions are far stronger than others. This data also allowed me to see whether over a period of an almost 2-year period, about 18 months, I think, that there was change in the utility of these experiences. And so there were 4 cycles of these critical incidents over this period of time. I should add that in the 3rd and 4th critical incidents, there were new processes brought in, and they were those associated with group discussions and also extending learning. And that's where there were questioning was used intentionally in the workplace to press the learners, the workers to understand more, and also where group discussions were used at safety meetings and production meetings to enhance learning. So by looking at this table, what we can see over time is that some things remain the same, but some things change. And the most noticeable change is if you look, questioning in the first critical incident, which is in the top left-hand quadrant, is fairly low. It's ranked lowly. But by the time we get to the 4th quadrant, the 4th critical incident interview, you'll see that questioning has come on top. Now, what I know is from spending a lot of time in that workplace that what happened was questioning was initially used by supervisors for workers, but then over time, what happened is the workers began to ask questions. So it became a far more frequent part of their practice. So again, this is the qualitative data that's been able to put it in quantitative form and then use that then to look at patterns of change, in this case, over time. And I think that'd be quite difficult to do just working from transcripts alone. Okay, and now we're going to talk about work-life history interviews. I'm going to pass over to Leah.
So the second scenario that we talk to discussing here is the work-life history interview. So it's part of an ARC project. So the research questions, the overall research question for this project is what societal, personal, educational, and workplace practices can best sustain employability across working life. So the purpose is to understand how individuals secure learning across their working life and how this learning can most effectively arise through work and educational activity to sustain their employability across their working life. So what we did is to conduct a series of interviews that capture retrospective accounts of individuals' work-life learning. So we got 30 details work-life history interviews collected, and the tentative findings, so it's mean the interviews, the analysis of the first rounds of interviews are then returned to participants at the later interviews for verification and to extend understanding. So what we identified from those first round interviews are their occupational transitions, their working lives. And also we identified the supporting factors that assisted them to sustain the employability across their life. So as I mentioned, so the first round of analysis involves identifying occupational transitions, and then an analytical framework that characterize the nature and character of changes was developed to map these occupational transition against. We also looking at the extended impact of those transition on sense of self, occupational practice, family and community and work-life pathways on 3 levels of high, medium and low. And also as we're looking at the initiation of these transition, what support the initiative and what kind of positive outcomes. So we use these to categorize the quality data to skew frequency and numerical weighting. So this is an example of the coding. So from the 30 detailed work-life history interviews, we identified 205 occupational transitions. So this is an example of a transition. So transition, we're talking about the change. So we use terms like becoming. So this is an example of one of the occupational transition, becoming employed, negotiating pay employment of different kinds. And as I mentioned earlier, is that we have an analytical framework developed that characterize the changes that initiate, shape, and represent work-life challenges. So these changes include the changing stages of life of individuals, the changes of the employment status, occupational change, change in location, physical and psychological health change, and personal lifestyle change. So we mapped or we categorize these 205 occupational transition against these values. So for this particular example, becoming employee, negotiating pay employment of different kinds. So we have the coding for this transition is it signifies a change of employment status and occupational change. So the impact of this transition on the work-life pathway is considered to be medium. And the initiation of transition, whether it's a personal imperative in response to a societal demand, whether it's a personal imperative in response to a group fact, or imperative largely driven by personal goals. For this particular example is a number 3, so imperative largely driven by personal goal. And also we look at the support for the initiative and the positive outcomes that you can see there in the example of coding. So we did this for across 205 occupational transition we identified from the first round interviews. So this is just a snapshot of this, the data representation. So on the first column, we have the transition, and then in the second column, we have change. So the reason that you can see ABCs there because of, in addition to the 6 kinds of changes, we identify sub-change here and the subcategories as well. So for example, for the occupational change, it could be change in occupation or it could be change in occupational focus. That's why we have A and B. So we, and we also, for the extent impact on sense of self, for example, is not just we identify, we categorize them whether it's high, medium, or low, but we also have a brief description of that impact that assists in making decision whether the impact is high, medium, and low. And we did that across 205 transition. And then you can see there we have other background information included there on the presentation, including gender, age, the backgrounds, and whether they're overseas born. So this is an example of the result of impact transition. So yeah, in addition to the level of impact, we also consider ways that the impact is positive and negative. And you can look, you can see that there's variation there. So the majority is high impact on the sense of self, where there's less variation for the occupational practice, family and community, and work-life pathway. For the positivity of the impact, we identify high level of is more positives in the where these transitions have on sense of self, occupational practice, family and community, and work-life pathway. So the last scenarios that we're discussing here is this study as try to find out the learning needs of working adults in Singapore and how we can make the education provision more effective for working adults. So there are 2 phases of this project. So the first phase is we conduct interviews with graduates from those courses of continuing education training courses. We have 178 interview completed. So the purpose is to evaluate whether these courses, the data gathering involving using an interview schedule that focuses on individual factors for attending those courses, their experiences and perception with these courses lecturer, the course provision within the institutes, and also their opinions about future provision of these continuing education and training courses. So we start with traditional analysis of interviews, thematic analysis using NVivo to produce data narratives. And then later we categorize these interview data under headings that permit numerical analysis, whether to assess their experience as positive, neutral, and negative, so that we can use the numerical weighting to assess variation by gender, age, qualification, and so on. So this is an example of how we code those variables under whether it's positive, neutral, or negative. One other set of in addition to experience with lecturer and CET provision, is the values of the course in helping them to achieve their goals, whether it's fully achieved, partially achieved, or not achieved. So the color coding indicators whether the representative quotes indicate a negative experience, which is in red, or is a positive one in blue, or is a neutral one in orange. So what we meant by aligning quantity and quality data under the same framing in NVivo and SPSS output is that in addition to creating notes on NVivo that link to the themes emerged from the interview data, we also create notes on NVivo that links to positive, negative, neutral utterance for narrative data reporting, in complementing to the coding on SPSS on overall perception on level 1, 2, 3, positive, neutral, and negative for statistical tests such as variation by demographic background. So this is to help with triangulation. So would you like to talk a bit more about this project?
No, just to say, thanks Leah. Just to say that project from Singapore then, as I said, it gathered interview data from 178 informants. We did actually do 180, but 2 declined to be consent to be interviewed. So we had this massive amount of data. And again, I found NVivo lacking in its ability to address some of the understandings, and by bringing together then we also did a survey when we sat these people down. These days when I do interviews of this kind, I give them a survey to fill out before turning on the digital recorder on my phone, and that's what we used. So we had the information from their survey about age, gender, work history, etc., qualifications. That was sitting somewhere, and then we brought that body of data together, which was in SBS, together with the SBS data, and then that's ended up in a spreadsheet. So hopefully that has led to some questions, or I realise we've gone through a lot of material fairly quickly. Certainly that overhead will be available to anybody that would like it. And we will conclude the session, I guess. Alrighty, well, thank you very much for coming along and listening. Should you be interested in the PowerPoints, please send me a message and I'll send you a copy of that. That's fine. And should you want to discuss any aspect of that, very happy to engage with you to do so. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I say thank you again, Stephen and Leah. Stephen, I know you've got a long history ever since I've been at Griffith of always wanting to support HDRs and early career staff and mid-career staff on all your projects, and it's regularly being noted, but it should be our appreciation is expressed again. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
And Leah, thanks. It's great to see someone who was an HDR student at Griffith now coming along and being a leader in this field. And you should be really proud of the work you've done, and it's really significant and a good contribution to the university. So thank you very much.